One, two, three. Good day, class. This is the second in the two-part lectures that we're going to be covering this coming Monday. One of the questions that we rarely ask, we just assume that we've always been here in East Tennessee, here in the United States. But as the screen asks, where do you come from? Where do Americans come from? Where do different Americans from different backgrounds come from? Because most Americans, if you traced your ancestry back, did not originate here in North America or even Latin America. We talk about immigrants all the time, and many of the immigrants that come to this country themselves are ancestors of immigrants. So, to understand the Western world, to understand the growth of the Western world, we have to look at European colonization of the Western Hemisphere, of the quote New World. Now, your book actually does not discuss European colonization and exploration until after the chapters on the Renaissance and the Reformation. However, I arrange my class differently because I don't think that you can fully understand the Renaissance and especially the Reformation until you understand where Spain's power comes from in the Reformation period, where the conflicts during both the Renaissance and the Reformation stem from. And one of the catalysts for the change in society is the increased trade, stimulated in part by the discovery of the New World. So we're actually jumping forward to chapter 14. So if you haven't read it already, you need to read chapter 14. Now, one of the questions that many people ask is, why did the Europeans decide to go exploring when they did? Well, the end of the Middle Ages is a good start. If you can remember from our previous lecture, those three events that act as the bookend for the Middle Ages, what were they? Well, number one is the end of the 100 Years' War. Number two, the fall of Constantinople. And then three are the voyages of Columbus. So why did Columbus and his contemporaries, because it's not only Columbus that is sailing the ocean blue, why is Columbus and his contemporaries exploring when they did? Well, we're going to get to the particulars here in a minute, but there are some general reasons why this map shows what it shows. For one thing, over the course of the Middle Ages, even though compared to today the medieval period was relatively static, there were some important developments that occurred in the High and Late Middle Ages. One is the development of better navigation technology. European ships at the time of the early Middle Ages were nothing more than, well, outgrowths of the galleys of the Roman era. Galleys, these things that you see in the movie like Ben-Hur, where you see men slaving away, rowing these things, are ill-suited for rough seas like you experience in the Atlantic. So galleys are good in the Mediterranean, and the other sail-powered ships of the Mediterranean at this time period are relatively small. But over the course of the Middle Ages, ships get larger, more advanced, and more seaworthy, especially for transatlantic travel. There are also some important developments when it comes to navigation. Number one, the development of something called the sextant. The sextant is a device that uses lenses and mirrors that allows a navigator to either use the sun or the stars to fix their location north to south, this way. It doesn't allow them to fix their location east to west, but north to south. So at least part of the axes necessary for knowing where you're at on the globe is solved with the invention of the sextant. The other is the improvement of map-making technology in the late Middle Ages. Again, navigators. We often think of navigators as being these generic people who know how to read maps. Well, at the late Middle Ages, the navigator was a specialized individual that tended to come from one country. Italy, which had the most experience in seagoing travel at this time, since the merchants of Italy, the land that would become Italy, were the people who controlled and dominated the Mediterranean trade for the Europeans. And so they had a vested interest in developing the skills, such as knowing how to use a sextant, but also how to make accurate maps. This is quite hard to do. Think about this. Today our maps are aided by GPS, by satellite pictures, by airplane overflights. These navigators, when they're making their maps, they're having to take measurements on the ground on a rolling ship as they make maps of the coastlines of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and then finally with the discovery of North and South America, those continents. Now, we all know the story of Columbus, but how many of you know who Columbus actually was? Was Columbus Spanish? No, he wasn't. Columbus wasn't even his real name. His real name was Cristóvão Colombo. He was an Italian. He was an Italian navigator. So why is this Italian navigator working for Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain? Well, Italian merchants were already too preoccupied with the Mediterranean trade. They had no interest in the need to find ways around the Ottoman Empire. However, with the Ottoman capture of the Byzantine Empire and much of southeastern Europe, many leaders of Europe feared that their access to spices, to silk, and to other goods from the Near and Far East would be cut off. Two of these kingdoms that saw an opportunity were Portugal and Spain. If you remember from our last lecture, after the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, this area of Europe right here, the three kingdoms that had, or the three areas of Iberia that had remained free of Muslim influence, one of them would form the Kingdom of Portugal, the other two would be linked by marriage and form the Kingdom of Spain. Both were relatively poor. You know, they just got done spending almost 1,000 years forcing the Muslims out of their homeland. Now, this is no easy task. It's not just winning battles. It's literally forcing people who had converted to Islam out, or killing them, or reconverting them. So the Spanish and the Portuguese see economic opportunity in trying to find a way around the Ottomans. Now, one reason why Columbus does not approach the Portuguese is the Portuguese have already found a way to India and to the Far East by the time that Columbus approaches the Spanish crown. We'll talk about that here in a minute, but we're going to talk about Columbus since that's the person you know the most about. So Columbus approaches Ferdinand and Isabella with a crazy idea. He is going to sail west to get east. Now, contrary to popular belief, Europeans had long since discarded the idea that the world was flat. They knew that it was a round ball. However, most scholars at this time believed that the earth was too large to be sailed around. In an ironic twist, late medieval mathematicians calculated the size of the globe, and they actually got it close to being correct. The only problem is they didn't know that this and this were out there. So they assumed that everything between Europe and Africa over to China was nothing but water. And so when Columbus comes to the Spanish and says, hey, I'm going to sail west to get to Asia, people think this is a suicide mission, because you guys have to remember there are no technologies like water desalinators, refrigeration, canning. So what you take with you will be consumed or spoiled relatively quickly. And many people believe that if you sail off into the Atlantic, you're literally signing your death warrant. However, the Spanish have nothing to lose. If they're able to find a cheap, effective way to Asia, they can corner the market. And cornering the market will bring them vast amounts of wealth in the trade in spices and silk and things like that. They have nothing to lose, so that they sign on to this. They will fund Columbus's expedition. And so Columbus sets off, but one thing you have to remember is, even though he has funding, the people that are willing to sign on to sail with him are the dregs of society. So he has criminals, drunks, basically the people that no other ship captain will hire. And these people are about to mutiny when, miraculously, they spot land about where Columbus says the East Indies or Asia would start. So in this weird irony, we're here because Columbus was bad at math. He got incredibly lucky because it wasn't just open ocean, and it wasn't the East Indies. It was what is sometimes called the West Indies or the Caribbean, because Columbus initially lands on what is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the island of Santo Domingo. Now, initially, Columbus thinks this is actually India, that this is the East Indies, it is Asia. This is why we call Native Americans Indians. And many historians still believe that Columbus never realized, even though he made 4 voyages to the New World, that he never realized that this was a whole new continent. And Columbus would die on this 4th voyage. And of course, if he didn't know by the 4th voyage, he would never know. Now, why are the Spanish the ones that contract with Columbus? Well, that's because the Portuguese already have 2 other individuals that have found a more traditional route to Asia. In 1481, a full 11 years before Columbus set sail, the Portuguese navigator Bartholomew Dias sets out from Portugal here, and instead of going west, he sails down the coast of Africa, basically leapfrogging to get resources like food and water, until he reaches approximately where Cape Town, South Africa is at. This proves to Dias that Africa is not a continuous continent, that it finally ends and it can be circumnavigated, it can be navigated around. So he turns around, and once I get my pointer here, he sails back up the coast, reports his findings to the Portuguese crown, and then later on in 1498, another Portuguese navigator, a fellow by the name of Vasco da Gama, will follow Dias's footsteps down the coast of Africa. But this time, as you can see here in the map, he hopscotches up the eastern coast of Africa until he is able to jump across the Indian Ocean and land at Calicut, India. Now, this is no small feat, because by the time of da Gama's voyage, the east coast of Africa here was dominated by Muslim Africans. This is where Somalia is at. And so Diaz's men have to masquerade as Muslims on their last couple of visits to the African coast. But this proves that Africa can be navigated around, and so Portugal will dominate the trans-African trade routes to India from this point on. So Spain is trying to undercut this by finding an even shorter route. And this is why Columbus sets sail when he does. And Columbus, in finding the West Indies here, even though he does not realize that this may be a whole new world, the Spanish sailors and ship captains that come after him do. And once this is realized by the Spanish crown, they not only realize that this is a whole new world right here, but they can possibly circumnavigate it. So in 1519, Ferdinand Magellan is a Spanish ship captain that is ordered by the Spanish crown to circumnavigate the globe. So Magellan sets off, and he basically skips down the coast of South Africa, or South America, sails around the tip here, and then makes his way through the various islands of Micronesia until he gets to what is today the modern-day Philippines. By 1519, the Spanish have a new king, Philip II. And Philip II has these islands named after him. That's where the name the Philippines come from. However, the inhabitants of the Philippines, most notably the Moro tribesmen, don't the Europeans. And for whatever reasons, it's still debated by historians, Magellan and his men come into violent conflict with the native Filipinos. Magellan is killed, and he's buried in the Philippines. His remaining men continue to sail on until they circumnavigate Africa and make it back to Spain. Now, this is important for you guys to realize. Magellan starts out with 4 ships with full crews, approximately 50 men per ship. There is only one ship that finally makes it back to Spain, and only about 30 or 40 emaciated sailors. Contemporary accounts describe these men as the walking dead. The ship was so rotten and so full of, woodworms and other seaborne creatures basically eating the ship that it had to be sold for firewood. So this accomplishment, while it proved that you can get anywhere in the world via ocean navigation, it came at a cost. Now, the major impact on Europe and on the rest of the world is, of course, the Spanish conquest of what is today called Latin America, basically Central and South America. And before we talk about that conquest, we have to talk about the cultures that were there before Spanish contact. Because North and South America were not empty before the Spanish got here. There were diverse, and in Latin America, Central and South America, there were diverse and advanced societies. North America was not as advanced as South America, and there's a reason why that is. The people who initially migrated to the American continents came over on what is known as the Bering Land Bridge. In the last Ice Age, which occurred around 9000 AD, hunter-gatherer societies from Siberia crossed over what is now the Bering Straits water. It was frozen over, following migrating animals. The first ones to come over this found North America still covered in ice, so they continued to travel south. So they settled in Central and South America. So those Native Americans had a head start over the later people who came as the ice receded and settled in North America. For this reason, the first advanced civilizations in the Americas are here in Central America. This is what you might consider the cradle of Native American civilization. And the first civilization to actually be recorded are the Olmecs. The Olmecs existed in Central America about right here, also, right here in the Yucatan Peninsula, between 1200 and 400 BC. Now, we don't know that much about the Olmecs, other than they had cities. Up until just recently, the only evidence of Olmec architecture were these huge stone heads that stood about 6 to 8 feet tall. But recently, archaeologists have dug up evidence that there were cities in the Yucatan. It's just that over the past centuries, the jungle has literally consumed them. Now, the next civilization of importance are the Mayans. Now, the Mayans exist where this red rectangle is at. They also inhabited the Yucatan Peninsula area. Now, they existed between 300 AD and 800 AD, and we know a little bit more about the Mayans. They were supposedly descendants of the god that came in the form of the jaguar, so they were known as the people of the jaguar. They were a hierarchical civilization. They had a nobility and a royal family. They also practiced human sacrifice in two distinct ways. The first was actually killing prisoners of war. The second was the royal family would pierce their tongue and with a needle, a bone needle. And tied to this bone needle was a string. And they would literally drain royal blood into a vessel of some type. And this would be used in religious ceremonies as well. Now, the Mayans are best known, of course, for the fact that they were excellent astronomers. Astronomers that accurately laid out the solar system without the aid of modern telescopes, and well before the Europeans did. And of course, their timeline, their calendar is based on celestial movements. And of course, most famously, the Mayans predicted the end of their world in 2012. Now, of course, this caused a great stir and movies to be made and all of this. But the thing that many people don't realize is that when the Mayan prophecy was translated, it literally translated into an end to their society, an end to their world, because the Aztecs believed, not the Aztecs, but the Mayans believed that their society, their world, their consciousness, their universe was literally a dream of the gods. And that in 2012 the gods would wake up, and of course the world would end because the gods were awake. Now, their world did end, and it didn't end in 2012. Instead, it ended around 800 AD. And archaeologists and historians still are debating why the Mayans ended when they did. Now, when I say the Mayan civilization ends, it doesn't mean that the Mayan people, the ethnic group, ceased to exist. It means their civilization broke down and collapsed. And there are many theories for this collapse. Some historians argue that it was because of over-cultivation of crops. Basically, cutting down too much of the rainforest, growing too much stuff, leaching out all the resources, and then, of course, the land becomes infertile. Other historians point out that there was internal disputes and possibly even civil war. There could possibly have been a pandemic, some sort of disease. But for whatever the reason, the Mayan civilization collapses in about 800 AD. And it won't be until about 1345 that another centralized civilization is formed. And this is the civilization of the Aztecs. The Aztecs can best be described as a small group, small tribe that dominates the tribes around it. It did so because the Aztecs had an excellent military. Now, the Aztecs are interesting in that not only do they control much of what is today modern-day Mexico, right here, all the way down into Central America, but Mexico City is actually built on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. According to the Aztec myth, The Aztec tribe was a wandering nomadic tribe until their god, Quetzalcoatl, and this is a different spelling from the book. I apologize for that. But it's spelled actually in 2 or 3 different ways. Came to the Aztec leaders and said, build your capital where you see a hawk with a snake in its talons perching on a cactus. Now, according to the foundation myth of the Aztecs, they saw this on a small island in the middle of a shallow lake. This becomes the location of their capital, Tenochtitlan. Now, interesting enough, if you look at the Mexican flag, it is white, green, and red. But right in the center is a cactus with a hawk with a snake in its talons. Because the Mexicans today believe that they are the inheritors of the Aztec tradition. Now, the Aztecs also had a hierarchical society. You had a noble class with a royal family at the top. You had a priest class, but you also had a military class, a professional military. And this is how the Aztecs controlled the tribes around them. They dominated them first by conquering them and using their military to keep them in line. Now, why were the Aztecs so much... Why were they badasses? Well, it was the technology that they used. The Aztecs were Stone Age people, but they still used advanced body armor. Imagine this. Body panels, front and back, on your arms and also on the front of your legs, of woven mats that could deflect arrows and spear tips. Early helmets made out of gourds. And of course, the Aztecs used bow and arrows and spears themselves and were trained to use this. The Aztec soldiers were supported by a central administration. They didn't farm. They didn't do anything else. They trained to fight. They also had an interesting way of supporting themselves. Instead of going into battle with food and supplies on their back, weighting them down, they had animals that would literally follow them into battle and they would eat them. Any of you own a Chihuahua? Chihuahuas are not dogs bred for the Aztec nobility like you see in the, Disney cartoons and stuff like that. Chihuahuas were bred to be basically meals on wheels. They followed their owners into battle, and they were the perfect self-serving size. Now, the Aztecs believed that in order for their society to continue, in order for them to have good harvest, in order to keep the gods satisfied, they had to practice human sacrifices. And as the Aztec culture evolved, these human sacrifices become more ritualized and more grotesque. The priest class was notorious for not only sacrificing the tribute. These are people that the other tribes had to give to the Aztecs, but they would kill children, and they would do this publicly and do this very brutally. It was considered a good sign if an Aztec priest could cut open a victim's chest, remove their heart, and hold it up, and it still beat its last couple of beats. And of course, as we will see, this treatment by the Aztecs of the people around the Aztecs will breed resentment. Now, a close contemporary to the Aztec Empire are the Incas. The Incas existed in what is today modern day Peru and Chile, here on the west coast of South America. The capital of the Incan Empire was Cusco. And while the Incas had a professional military, what really allowed the Incas to dominate this very mountainous Andes mountain region was they were excellent engineers. They built roads that, let me see if I think your book, let's see here. Yes, your book on page 424 has a good illustration of the road network that fan out from Cusco, allowing the Incas not only to deploy their military quickly, but also to communicate over long distances and also have an effective trade network. So this is the world that the Spanish encounter when they land in the New World. Now, Excuse me. After conquering Santo Domingo, the Spanish move on and conquer the island that is today Cuba. Both of these islands have Native Americans on them when the Spanish arrive. However, disease and the treatment by the Spanish doom these native peoples to basic extinction. There are really no native peoples that are truly native to modern-day Haiti, the Dominican Republic, or Cuba. And Cuba becomes sort of like the staging area for further expeditions in the New World. And so by 1519, word gets back to the Spanish authorities in Cuba that there is this rich, wealthy, and powerful empire in Latin America. So in 1519, Hernan Cortes is tasked with the mission of discovering, going out and finding out who these people are and conquering them. And so Cortes lands in 1419. He's looking for gold. He's looking for wealth. And he lands in 1519 on the mainland of Latin America, of Central America, with only about 400 or 500 Spanish conquistadors. So how can these conquistadors overthrow the Aztec Empire that has a population of several 100,000 and a military class that is numbers in the thousands? Well, the Spanish have several advantages. And it's not firearms. Even though firearms exist at this time, these early firearms rarely work in the hot, humid, wet environment of Central America. But what they do have is steel armor, breastplates and helmets, so that when the Aztecs engage them, they seemingly are immune to the Aztecs' weapons. Secondly, Cortes himself, you can't tell this by this picture right here, but Cortes himself, by all accounts, was fair-skinned, sandy blonde-haired, and had light-colored eyes, either green or blue. This is the exact description of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. So the Aztecs actually think that Cortes is a deity in human form. Now, the two final advantages that the Spanish have that are really important is the Spanish under Cortes are able to co-opt the other tribes that have become resentful toward Aztec rule. And they have some help in this because Cortes takes as his lover a native woman who takes the Spanish name of Donna Maria. And Donna Maria is a native woman, so she speaks the native language, but she also learns to speak Spanish. So she acts as an interpreter and intermediary between the Spanish and the native peoples. And so Cortes builds a coalition of Spanish conquistadors and oppressed peoples to invade the heart of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. However, by the time that they reach the Aztec capital in 1521, there's really no fighting to be done because the Spanish's last and most important advantage has preceded them. The Spanish carry with them diseases, European diseases, diseases that the Native Americans have not been exposed to. So they've had contact with these native peoples, and many of the native peoples that are working with them are dying. But this is transmitted through the trade routes, through communications, through personal interactions to this Aztec capital itself. So according to the accounts of the Catholic monks that are with Cortes, when Cortes and his army enters the Aztec capital, the dead are lying in the streets. There's not enough people to even clean up the streets of all the dead people who are dying of smallpox. Smallpox decimates Native American populations. Not just the Aztec populations, but all Native American populations. Smallpox will spread to every corner of North and South America and reduce the native populations considerably. Once Cortez conquers the Aztec capital, the Spanish simply use the centralized governing apparatus that already exists in the Aztec Empire to disassemble both figuratively and literally the Aztec Empire and build a new Spanish Empire in its place. They actually call what is today Mexico New Spain. Now, shortly after conquering the Aztec Empire, a subordinate commander of Cortez is tasked with exploring South America because there's similar reports of another empire from this location. So in 1530, Francisco Pizarro leads an army of approximately about 400 conquistadors south to engage and possibly conquer the Incas in the south. And like their contemporaries in the Aztec Empire, the Incas are decimated by European diseases. The Spanish enter the capital of Cusco. Pizarro takes the last Aztec emperor captive, and the last Aztec emperor, if I'm going to pronounce his name right, it's Atahualpa. First takes this Incan emperor captive, and then once securing power, kills him, literally decapitating the Incan Empire and replacing it with Spanish rule. Now, why are the Spanish so brutal? Well, first and foremost, because of their experiences with the Reconquista, they consider people of color to be inferior, to be infidels. These are the same type of people, dark people, that had oppressed them starting in the 8th century AD, and they had to throw them out. These are non-Christians. The Spanish are also desperately seeking revenue. So one of the things that the Spanish are desperately seeking to get is wealth in the form of gold and silver. So if you want to remember a quick way of the three reasons why the Spanish explore and conquer Latin America, it's the 3 G's: gold, God, and glory. Gold is self-explanatory. The Spanish want to strip these empires of their wealth, ship it back to Spain, and make Spain the richest and wealthiest European kingdom, which they do by the mid-1500s. God. These people are still Christians, and many of them, especially the clergy, feel that it is their God-given duty to convert the Native American populations to Christianity. And then finally, these conquistadors are military men. They're military commanders. And how do you make a name for yourself in the military? How do you gain promotion? You don't do it by sitting behind a desk administering, say, supplies. You don't do this being a pencil pusher. This is why military men hunger for command in the field, even today. Because if you want to make it to a high rank, you have to command men in battle. And so, glory, fighting against the Aztecs and the Incas, will give Cortez, Pizarro, and other Spanish conquistadors the glory and recognition that they desire. Now, the Spanish are not the only ones who start to explore Latin America. After establishing trade routes around Africa here, the Portuguese establish a small colony here on the tip of South America in 1494. This will become Brazil. However, the potential for conflict between the Spanish and the Portuguese is too great, and the Catholic Church actually forces them to come to an agreement known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. Excuse me. This treaty will draw a line on the map separating those areas designated for Portuguese exploration and Spanish exploration. Now, the first thing that you're probably saying is, why in the hell do the Spanish get the big end of the stick? They get the biggest piece of the cake. This treaty was signed in the late 1490s. Look at the dates of Cortez and Pizarro. The Spanish and other Europeans have no clue that all of this is out here. By 1494 and 1495, they still think that these land masses that they have landed on are still the islands that lead up to Asia. So, this is why most of Latin America is Spanish, but it's also why the country of Brazil speaks Portuguese. Now, let's not leave off the fact that Europeans will explore North America. And actually, the first Europeans to explore North America are not anybody that you would probably recognize. The first people are the Norsemen, the Vikings. Around 1000 AD, the Vikings land in what is today Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, here, after colonizing Greenland and Iceland. They call this Vinland. The Native Americans, they call Skraelings. Now, the Viking colonies here don't last very long. By 1300, the Vikings abandon these colonies. And so the Viking influence on North America is negligible, but we need to point out that they were the first here. Now, who are the real first people to settle in North America, to explore North America? Is it the English? No. Again, it's the Spanish. We're going to look at three of the most important Spanish conquistadors, Spanish explorers that open up the doorway to European colonization to North America. Ponce de Leon is tasked with exploring to the north of Cuba in 1513. And in 1513, he explores what is today the state of Florida. Now, Ponce de Leon still thinks that Florida is just a big island like Cuba. It's not until much later that the Spanish realize that this is connected to something a lot larger. And in 1539, the Spanish conquistador, Ponce de Leon, not Ponce de Leon, but forgot his name. Hold on a minute. Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto is ordered to explore what is today the modern day American Southeast. And so between 1539 and 1543, de Soto explores up through Florida into what is today modern day Alabama, possibly Mississippi, as far north as Chattanooga, possibly even farther than that, and then heading south along the lay of the land through what is today Mississippi, and then across Louisiana, and then to the coast of Texas, and then back down into New Spain. It's kind of interesting, when I was at Hattiesburg, Mississippi, working in graduate school, I-59 that runs between Meridian, Mississippi and New Orleans, you see all these places down the interstate. De Soto Campsite, De Soto National Forest. The reason why is I-59 is built in the same lay of the land that De Soto traveled. So when they were digging the interstate, they actually dug up some of De Soto's campsites. Now, what does De Soto report back? Well, kind of interestingly enough, De Soto describes the American Southeast as a wasteland. So we live in a wasteland. Now, is a wasteland to the Spanish, because the Spanish are looking for large empires that they can conquer easily and take over their land, to strip them of their wealth. In the American Southeast, you have Native Americans, but they're incredibly diverse, fragmented tribes. You can conquer one, but that doesn't mean that you're conquering the ones around them. And they have little in the form of wealth that the Spanish want. So this is one reason why the Spanish don't start to push into what is today the American Southeast. The farthest that they get is they found St. Augustine in 1565. St. Augustine is the oldest permanently occupied European settlement in North America. But in terms of the eastern North American continent, That's about as far north as the Spanish get. They basically colonized Florida, and that's it. However, in the west, the Spanish tasked Conquistador Francisco Coronado, this guy right here with the, the angry face, with exploring the western parts of this new land. And as you can see on the map here, Coronado basically travels around what is today the southwest. The map doesn't show that he actually will travel all the way to the west coast, and around where San Diego is at will found a mission. And here on the west coast around San Diego is the oldest mission, the oldest European settlement in the western United States. But again, Coronado reports that this is a wasteland. There are no centralized kingdoms. There's no wealth. There's no fountain of youth. There's no El Dorado, the city of gold. And so Coronado and his expedition travels back south into New Mexico, thus limiting the Spanish influence here in North America. Now, you might be asking, if word is getting out in the early 1500s that there's new land out here, why aren't the other Europeans taking advantage of this? Why aren't the English, the Dutch, or the French setting sail to establish their own colonies? Well, this is partly due because the Spanish use this wealth that they take from the Aztecs and the Incas to immediately build up their kingdom into a powerful and militarily strong empire. They have the strongest navy by the mid-1500s. And of course, this navy is used to basically bar the other European powers from colonizing North America. However, this will change. This will change in 1588 because the English know North America is out there. Very early on, early in the 1500s, actually in the late 1400s, John Cabot explores right in here. He does so in 1497 and 1498. Cabot, again, is not an Englishman. He works for the English crown, but again, his real name is Genovese Caboto. He is an Italian navigator. And of course, he reports back what he has found, but the problem is that Spanish fleet. And as we will talk about later in class, 1588 is an important year. 1588 is important during the European Reformation, but it's also important for the settlement of the New World. In 1588, the Spanish king, Philip II, will send half of his fleet almost, a Spanish armada as it's known, to carry Spanish ground troops to conquer England. Now, why conquer England? Why in 1588? Well, as we will talk about in greater detail in a later lecture. In the mid-1500s, Henry VIII will separate himself and his kingdom from the Catholic Church. He needs a male heir. The Pope refuses to give him a divorce from his first wife because she has failed to give him a male heir. And so he just creates his own church, the Church of England. He's the head of the Church of England and can grant himself his own divorce. Kind of convenient. This will bring England into direct conflict with the other Catholic countries of Europe. Now, England will go through some turmoil that we'll talk about later on, but by the late 1500s, England is ruled by Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth I is a Protestant queen, but she is not recognized as the legitimate queen of England by the other European powers, most notably Spain. Spain under Philip recognizes another heir to the English throne, a woman by the name of Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart. Now, Mary Stuart is a Catholic descendant of the same grandfather of Elizabeth. They're cousins. And so Mary Stuart, who is fleeing after losing a civil war in Scotland, she comes to England seeking basically sanctuary. But she is a threat to Elizabeth's power because, well, to put it bluntly, she's scheming with Elizabeth's Catholic opposition in England. And so Elizabeth finally listens to her advisors and puts Mary to death. She's beheaded in 1587. Of course, this eliminates any threat domestically, but since Elizabeth has killed the legitimate queen in the eyes of the Spanish, for example, they use this as an excuse to invade. So in 1588, this armada is sent. However, men like Sir Francis Drake effectively leads a defense of smaller English ships in the English Channel. They decimate the Spanish armada, destroying most of it. And so after 1588, the Spanish have limited naval resources to continue to explore North America while at the same time defending their established colonies in South America. What would you do? You have wealthy gold, silver, and tin mines in Central and South America. Are you going to run the risk of having them undefended to explore an area of the world that you think is a wasteland? Probably not. So this is one reason why the Spanish do not colonize North America. This opens the doorway for the English. And so in 1607, the first permanent English colony is founded here off the coast of Virginia. This is Jamestown. Jamestown is founded as a commercial farm. This is not a colony people are coming to flee, to set up a new life. No. This is a colony where usually young men are traveling to the New World to grow commercial crops like wheat and tobacco, make their fortunes, and go back to England wealthy. In 1609, Henry Hudson, the English ship captain, explores what is today the Hudson River. The Hudson River is important because it is navigable, at least by the ships of the age, so that ocean-going ships can travel into the interior of the North American continent, thus facilitating colonization and settlement. In 1623, the Dutch get into the act of colonization because they purchased Manhattan Island from the Manhattan Indians and established New Amsterdam, where New York City now is. New Amsterdam was the original name because in the 1640s, the English and the Dutch will fight a small naval war in which the English win, and part of the treaty stipulates that the Dutch have to give up their North American colonies, so New Amsterdam becomes New York. Now, the English and the Dutch are not the only ones colonizing North America. The French are also exploring North America. In 1534, French explorers Jacques Cartier discovers the St. Lawrence River. Shortly thereafter, the city of Quebec is founded. Likewise, in 1672, French explorers discover the Mississippi River, and New Orleans is founded again as a point of entry. Now, the interesting thing about French exploration as opposed to English exploration and colonization is that the English are actually setting up permanent colonies. The French, for the most part, do not set up permanent colonies. Their main colonies are Quebec in the north, here, and New Orleans in the south. These are basically large trading posts. This area that the French are claiming as their territory, they're not really setting up communities. Instead, the French settlers that are there are trappers that are trapping animals like beavers, for example, traders who are trading with the enemy for animal hides and other things, and Christian missionaries. So you don't have self-reproducing communities in these French areas for the most part, like you do have along the coast here with the English. Now, as these colonies, especially the English colonies, grow, they develop commercially, and they start to shift away from their original labor source. The original labor source for Jamestown and the other colonies that come after it are indentured servants. Indentured servants are Englishmen who sell their labor. They basically sell themselves into temporary slavery in exchange for travel to the New World plus a stipend of land or money once their term of indentured servitude is over with, usually 5 to 10 years. However, by 1676, indentured servants will start to rebel against their landlords. This will give impetus for a shift away from indentured servants to owned slaves. And the first slaves actually arrive in Jamestown in 1619. The other type of colony that is being founded is not a commercial colony like Jamestown. These are New England colonies that are founded as havens for political and religious refugees. In the 1620s, so-called religious separatists, we call them pilgrims, settle in what is today Massachusetts. What is a separatist? Well, a separatist are English Protestants. They believe that the Church of England, and we'll discuss the separatists and the pilgrims in greater detail in later lectures, but they believe that the Church of England is still too Catholic. It has too many of the aspects of the faith that they have broken away from and that they think is corrupt. They want to separate themselves from the Church of England and have an even less Catholic religion. They share many of the same religious tenets as the Puritans. The only difference is, while the separatists believe that they should separate themselves and live apart from other Englishmen, the Puritans believe that it is their duty to purify the Church of England, hence the name, and get rid of all of the Catholic-like aspects of the Church of England. Well, in the 1620s, the separatists, who are a little bit more peaceful, make a deal with the English crown. Simply put, we'll get out of your hair here in Europe if you give us the right to settle in land claimed by the English throne. And so as the 1620s, the Pilgrims sail aboard the Mayflower and establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In a decade later, the Puritans, also a politically and religiously oppressed minority in England, start to leave England and also settle in what is today Massachusetts. And they will literally be forced out, and we'll talk about why that is later in class. So what are the initial impacts of European contact with the New World? Well, the biggest thing is you have the migration of dissidents, settlers, and fortune hunters to the Americas. People wanting to get rich quick, find freedom, and just make a new life for themselves. We see the enslavement and the death of native populations in Latin America mainly. We see the escalation of Indian warfare because with the introduction of Europeans, they introduce European politics and European weapons, metal weapons, into a Stone Age into a Stone Age society. And since you have so many European powers, the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Spanish, all colonizing the New World, the Americas become part of what Europeans called the Great Game for empire. And what is beneficial to us is, since these colonies are so far from the European mother countries, and since the English colonies in particular are basically left to develop on their own, the colonists begin to see themselves as something different from other Englishmen. And of course, this is the origins of the American mind, the American mindset. The biggest impact, however, is what historians call the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is simply the exchange of goods, plants, animals, ideas, people, and diseases, from old world to new and from new world to old. As you can see on this slide, there are things that we take for granted here in this country, like wheat, sugar, bananas, cattle, horses. These came from the old world. Yes, bananas are not native to Latin America. Likewise, there are things like potatoes, beans, and pumpkins that were unheard of in the old world before Columbus. So the next time you eat some Irish food and it's got a lot of potatoes in it, well, guess what? The Irish didn't know what a potato was until the 1500s. Now, likewise, Europeans introduced things like the measles, typhus, and especially smallpox, and it decimates Native American populations. Well, the native populations get a little bit of payback because even though a form of syphilis did exist in Europe before the age of Columbus, there was a more virulent form in the Americas, and these conquistadors, after conquering and raping their way across Latin America, they take that back to Europe as well. And this is one reason why in the 16 and 1700s, syphilis becomes an incredibly bad and chronic problem in Europe. Now, to shift gears, let's talk about probably the biggest exchange as part of the Columbian Exchange. And that is the exchange of enslaved humanity. Because the African slave trade, the transatlantic African slave trade, would not have been possible if it was not for the discovery of the Americas. To understand the slave trade, we have to first look at European contact with Africa, and then slavery in Africa before European contact. Now, the Portuguese were the first explorers with Vasco da Gama and Diaz to make contact with African tribes along the African coast. Now, these Portuguese set up forts to defend the route from Europeans and from Muslims. And these forts along the coast of Africa become beachheads in this new land. These are beachheads for not only influence, but trade and commerce. And so, at first, Europeans were welcomed by many of the African tribal leaders because they brought trade with them. They brought new items. They brought metal goods to a Stone Age society. And of course, if you were the African tribal leader that was in good with the local fort, this was a way of showing off your prestige. And just like some African rulers in the north converted to Islam for political and economic reasons, Christianity also began to make inroads into Africa as well. Now, before European contact, slavery had existed in Europe then as well. Slavery was not created by the Europeans. Slavery was a product of Africa. Slavery actually is and was practiced by every society in recorded history, and slavery still exists today, sadly. But what becomes known as African slavery or black slavery was first started in Africa because these tribes warred with each other. And when they took captives, these captives were declared as property of the tribal leaders. And these tribal leaders would sell them off to the people that they ruled, to have an income, to fill their coffers. And so these people were enslaved. They had no rights. And they normally worked as part of the household, farming, cooking. Now, the big difference between African slavery in Africa and the European slave trade is not really the difference in rights. It's the scale. African tribesmen tended to own only, say, 3, 4, or 5 slaves apiece. While these slaves were considered property, they were still somebody that you got to know, somebody that you had a relationship with. However, when slavery is introduced into the New World by the Portuguese and then later the Spanish, they will use them on a massive scale Hundreds of slaves being used on plantations, sugar plantations, or the Spanish mines, mining silver and gold and tin and other metals. They become just a faceless mass, just a resource to be used. Now, European traders took advantage of this pre-existing system. And so they didn't have to capture the slaves. They simply bought them from African slave dealers. However, because of the European desire to basically convert the New World into a giant commercial farm or a place to get natural resources, demand for labor was incredibly high. The European population was too small to fill this need, because Europeans are not just going to pack it up and go to the New World. They've got, most of the Europeans have jobs there in Europe. Also, New World diseases have decimated the Native American population, so even though they were enslaved, most of them die in just under 100 years. And as I said before, having somebody that you own is better than somebody that you have to hire. And so slavery explodes in Central and South America. So, what is the character of slavery in the New World? Well, the first slaves arrive as early as 1501. Guess who? They're being traded by Columbus. So Columbus is not only the discoverer of the New World, he not only enslaves Native Americans, but he is also one of the first people to trade in African slaves. By 1518, the Portuguese are basically turning Brazil into a slave-based economy and shipping slaves directly to Brazil. In 1520, the Spanish do likewise and start using slaves in their silver mines. And the basically the central exchange, the sort of the clearinghouse of slaves in Spanish America is the Caribbean. Cuba is basically the clearinghouse for much of the New World. And of course, by the 1600s, Dutch and English colonists are buying slaves from the Caribbean and shipping them to North America. So if we look at the numbers of slaves being transported to the New World, the lion's share are being transported first to Brazil and then to the Caribbean and Latin America. Very few actually are transported to North America. Even fewer are transported to Europe, like Spain, France, and England. So if we think our race problems in this country are complex and sometimes bad, think about the race problems in Latin America, because a larger percentage of the population has ancestors that originate because of this, human trafficking. Now, this trafficking in enslaved humans becomes known as the triangular trade. Because if you take the New World as one destination itself, Europe as one destination, and Africa as one destination, it basically creates a triangle over the Atlantic. So how does this work? Africa or European slavers would travel to Africa. They would trade manufactured goods, alcohol, and other European products for slaves from African slave dealers. They would then travel over what becomes known as the Middle Passage to sell these slaves either in Brazil or here in the Caribbean. Now, this Middle Passage is notorious because as demand increases, basically African tribes start to organize slave raids to fill this demand. So instead of just selling off their excess war captives, they're purposely going to war to enslave people. And of course, this is made even worse when firearms are introduced to the mix. Now, as demand increases, it means the price that you can ask for a slave goes way up. And slave ship owners will cram as many slaves into the holds of their ships as they can. As you can see from this contemporary loading diagram, slaves are literally stacked in shelves that are no taller than 2 feet tall, usually 3 to 4 shelves tall, in the holds of these ships, shoulder to shoulder. And they're kept down there for most of the voyage, only being brought up every day for they rotate them up on deck so that they can get a little bit of exercise, get a breath of fresh air. But for the most part, they're down there in the holds, and I'm serious, they're chained to these racks. So if you got to go to the bathroom, you're just crapping on yourself and the 2 or 3 guys below you. You're peeing on the people below you. You have people dying next to you. People suffering from heat exhaustion and dying from lack of water or too much heat. And those that die are dumped over the side. Just unceremoniously just dumped over the side. And then, of course, when they make it to their destination here, they're sold off. They're sold off and then traded for those goods that are made or farmed or produced in the Americas, like cotton, rum, tobacco, tin, gold, and transported back to Europe. Now, upon arrival to the New World, you just can't sell a slave. These are people that have just been captured. They still believe that they're free people. So, before you sell a slave, you have to, quote, season them. This means you have to break them like you break a horse. So this involves beatings. This involves maltreatment. This involves possible killing a couple of them. Once the slaves are seasoned, they're put up for sale at a slave auction. This means that the men are inspected, forced to perform manual labor to prove that they're able to perform tasks. The women, on the other hand, are basically inspected as good breeding stock. So they're molested, literally. And then finally, they're sold off. Most slaves, especially in Latin America, are used in large-scale agricultural or mining operations. The first major cash crops were sugar, rice, and tobacco. Rice and tobacco are the main products of North America. Sugar is the main product of the Caribbean and Latin America. Now, one of the things that separates slavery from North American slavery from South American slavery is the treatment. Because on the Brazilian sugar plantations, for example, most of the slaves brought in were men, because the Portuguese basically treated these individuals as Kleenex, somebody to be used and thrown away. So the lifespan of a slave on a sugar plantation, which is known as a enero, which translates to engine, was measured in days and weeks, not years. That's one reason why such a massive number of African slaves were transported to Portugal, or not Portugal, but Portuguese Brazil. These places were hellholes. Slaves would die in the fields. Heat exhaustion, tropical diseases, tropical snakes. They would work in the sugar mills. These are early industrial mills where sugar cane is shredded, pressed, and then the cane juice is cooked down into sugar. So at any time you could be crushed in the sugar press, you could be cut up by the blades of the sugar, the things that shred the sugar cane. A giant vessel of cooking sugar could break open. And if you guys have ever cooked with sugar, you know that hot sugar is like napalm. Contrary to this, North American or English slave holders tended to import equal numbers of men and women. The environment in North America was much more conducive to, well, a longer lifespan, and also the crop, rice and tobacco, was not as harsh a crop to grow as sugar was. And in creating these self-reproducing slave populations, you got men and women, it stabilizes the slave system, but it also ingrains it. This is one reason why in North America, in the United States, for example, white and black, up until recently, have been so rigid. In Latin America, however, since you had basically mainly African men being imported. African men would mix with poor Europeans, poor Native American women, and you get a mixed mulatto population. And over time, these countries that come out of the Spanish Empire of South America, they have to get rid of slavery simply because they lose track of who's free and who's slave. Because there's no way to tell by skin color what their social status is. In North America, it's quite easy. A free man is white, a slave is black. So if we look at the slave cultures of Latin America as opposed to North America, plantation owners basically used up slaves and imported more. In North America, however, they treated the slaves better. However, they treated them as a permanent, childlike, subordinate class. And of course, this would characterize the race relations of the two regions. So finally, if we are looking at the number of slaves imported into North America, this diagram gives you a clear indication of the number of slaves that are imported in. Again, Brazil, the lion's share. The Caribbean, these two areas right here, huge numbers. North America, relatively small. Only like Peru and Mexico are smaller than that here in the Americas. Now, before I leave you guys, I want you guys to read about this in the book, because the book actually goes into a little bit better detail on some of the points that I brought up about Spanish and Portuguese exploration, about the slave trade. And I want you guys to ask yourself, first, how do these goods, how do this wealth that the Portuguese and the Spanish get from their empires, either by just taking it or manufacturing, like the sugar plantations, how will it affect European power politics? Also, how does basically the missing out of the Spanish of colonizing North America change the dynamic for European power politics as well? We'll talk about these things plus more during our class lecture. I will see you on Monday, and I hope this is a little bit more of an interesting lecture than some of the previous ones. Again, sadly, we're not doing this face-to-face because it would be a whole lot more interesting. I'll talk to you guys on Monday. Have a good day.